Mr. Johnson stood in the middle of the courtroom, his frail hands gripping the wooden table. His eyes, filled with pain and desperation, searched for mercy, but none was found. He was an old man, his back slightly bent with age, his dark brown skin wrinkled by time. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Your Honor, please. I have lived in that house for 40 years. My wife and I raised our children there. I paid my rent on time. I did nothing wrong." His breath was heavy, his heart pounding in his chest. "Please, don't take my home away from me." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, barely looking at the elderly man. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s, his black robe perfectly pressed, his golden watch gleaming under the courtroom lights. His cold blue eyes showed no sympathy, only boredom. He tapped his fingers on the desk, waiting for the old man to finish speaking. "Are you done?" His voice was sharp, impatient. Mr. Johnson swallowed hard. He looked at the landlord's lawyer, a young man in an expensive suit, smirking with confidence. He had presented fake documents, claiming Mr. Johnson had missed several rent payments. Mr. Johnson had proof that he had paid, but the judge had refused to even look at it. His hand shook as he held up the papers. "Please, Your Honor, I have the receipts right here. Just take a look." Judge Harrison sighed loudly and shook his head. "I don't need to see them. The court has made its decision. The eviction stands." He banged his gavel, and the sound echoed through the silent room. It was over. Just like that, the life Mr. Johnson had built was gone. A heavy silence fell over the room. The people in the courtroom exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them had seen this happen before. Poor families losing their homes, the rich winning every case. The judge didn't care about justice. He cared about money, and everyone knew it. Mr. Johnson stood frozen in place. His knees felt weak. He had worked all his life, followed every rule, been an honest man, and now he had nothing. He turned to the judge one last time, his voice breaking. "Where am I supposed to go? I'm 72 years old. My wife, she passed away last year. That house is all I have left." Judge Harrison didn't even blink. "That is not this court's concern." Tears burned in Mr. Johnson's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. His fingers tightened around the papers in his hand, crumpling them. His heart ached, not just from the loss, but from the unfairness of it all. He had believed in the system. He had trusted the law. But the law had turned its back on him. The landlord's lawyer walked past him with a smug grin. "Better start packing, old man," he whispered before walking out the door. Mr. Johnson's hands clenched into fists. He had never felt such anger before. He had spent his entire life being kind, believing in doing what was right. But what good had it done? He had been polite. He had been patient. And now he was standing in a courtroom, alone, with nothing. The courtroom emptied out, people shaking their heads as they left. A few muttered to each other, "That judge is corrupt. He's been doing this for years." Others sighed, already knowing there was nothing anyone could do. Mr. Johnson felt a soft hand on his arm. He turned and saw a young woman, her brown eyes filled with concern. She had been sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching everything. "Mr. Johnson," she said gently, "my name is Lisa Carter. I'm a reporter. I think something very wrong happened here." He let out a bitter laugh. "Something wrong? This whole system is wrong." Lisa nodded. "I've been investigating Judge Harrison for months. I think he's been taking bribes from wealthy landlords. He's been throwing innocent people out of their homes to help the rich get richer." Mr. Johnson frowned. His chest tightened with anger. "You're saying he was paid to throw me out?" Lisa nodded. "Yes, and not just you. There are many others." Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had spent his whole life believing in justice, but now he saw the truth. Justice didn't come to those who waited for it. Justice had to be taken. Lisa hesitated before speaking again. "I have proof. Documents, recordings. but I need help to expose him." Mr. Johnson looked down at the crumpled papers in his hand. His home was gone. His memories, his safety, his entire life had been stolen. He had nothing left to lose. He looked back at Lisa, his eyes no longer filled with sadness. They were filled with determination. "Tell me what I need to do," he said. Mr. Johnson sat across from Lisa Carter in a small diner on the edge of town. The place smelled of fresh coffee and toasted bread, but he had no appetite. His hands rested on the table, still trembling from what had happened in court. His mind replayed the judge's cold words, the landlord's smug grin, the sound of the gavel sealing his fate. Lisa pulled out a small notebook and flipped through the pages. "Judge Harrison has been doing this for years," she said, her voice low. "I've spoken to at least 10 families who lost their homes just like you. Every time, the landlords are the same, the lawyers are the same, and the judge never looks at the evidence." Mr. Johnson's jaw tightened. He had spent his whole life believing in justice, but now he felt like a fool. "Why hasn't anyone stopped him?" he asked. Lisa sighed. "Because he's powerful. He has connections, and most people are too scared to fight back." She met his eyes. "But you're not like most people, are you?" Mr. Johnson straightened in his seat. He was tired. Tired of being ignored, tired of losing. He had done everything right his whole life, and it had gotten him nowhere. Maybe it was time to do things differently. Lisa pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "I have evidence," she whispered. "Bank transactions, secret meetings, even a few recorded conversations. But it's not enough. People need to see it for themselves." Mr. Johnson opened the folder. His eyes scanned the pages. Documents linking the judge to wealthy landlords. Hidden payments disguised as legal fees. His hands gripped the papers tighter. The anger inside him burned hotter. Lisa leaned in. "I need someone to go undercover. Someone Judge Harrison won't suspect. Someone who can get him to admit what he's doing." Mr. Johnson looked up, confused. "You want me to trick him?" Lisa nodded. "If we can get him on tape admitting he takes bribes, we can expose him to the world." Mr. Johnson exhaled slowly. It was risky. The judge was dangerous, but he had already lost everything. What else was there to fear? He looked Lisa in the eye and nodded. "Tell me what I have to do." "You said." The plan was risky, but Mr. Johnson knew it was his only chance to fight back. He sat in Lisa Carter's small office, the dim light casting shadows on the stacks of papers and old case files scattered across the desk. The air smelled of ink and coffee, but his mind was too focused to notice. Lisa handed him a tiny recording device, no bigger than a coin. "This is our best shot," she said. "If you can get Judge Harrison to admit to taking bribes, we'll have undeniable proof." Mr. Johnson turned the device over in his hands. He had never done anything like this before. He had spent his whole life following the rules, trusting the system. But that same system had just tossed him aside like he was nothing. His home was gone, his dignity stripped away. He had nothing left to lose. Lisa placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this if you're not sure." Mr. Johnson met her eyes, his expression firm. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The next day, he found himself walking into the grand courthouse once again. This time, he wasn't here to beg. He was here to bring down the man who had stolen everything from him. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached Judge Harrison's office. The judge was sitting behind a large mahogany desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up, surprised to see the old man standing in the doorway. "Back so soon, Mr. Johnson," he said with a smirk, "hoping I changed my mind." Mr. Johnson forced a weak smile and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "No, Your Honor. I came to talk business." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Business." Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, his fingers brushing against the hidden recorder in his pocket. "I don't have anywhere else to go. I need my home back, and I know how things work around here. He hesitated, then pulled the thick envelope from his coat. Inside was fake cash. Lisa had put it together to make the bribe look real. "I can make it worth your while." Judge Harrison leaned forward, eyeing the envelope with amusement. He chuckled. "Now you understand how the world works, old man." He took a sip of his whiskey. "You pay, you stay. That's the way it's always been." Mr. Johnson swallowed hard, his hand steady despite the anger boiling inside him. "And how many others have done the same?" he asked carefully. The judge smirked, completely unaware of the trap he was walking into. "Oh, you'd be surprised. You think you're the first one desperate enough to make a deal." He laughed, shaking his head. "I've made a fortune off fools like you." Mr. Johnson's pulse raced. He had what he needed. Every word was being recorded, but he couldn't let the judge get suspicious. He nodded, sliding the envelope closer. "So, do we have a deal?" The judge reached for the envelope, but before he could grab it, the door burst open. Lisa and 2 police officers stormed in. "Step away from the desk, Judge Harrison," one officer commanded. "We have you on tape." The judge's face turned pale. His eyes darted to Mr. Johnson, realization hitting him like a ton of bricks. You set me up." Mr. Johnson straightened his back, feeling stronger than he had in years. "No, Judge, you set yourself up." For the first time, the mighty Judge Harrison looked powerless. The officers grabbed his arms, snapping handcuffs around his wrists. The smirk was gone. The arrogance was gone. And as he was dragged away, Mr. Johnson felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Justice," you said. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, Judge Harrison's arrest was all over the television, the internet, and the front pages of newspapers. People who had once been afraid to speak out now came forward, sharing their own stories of injustice. The courthouse steps were packed with protesters, chanting for fairness, for change. Mr. Johnson stood outside Lisa's office, watching everything unfold. He still couldn't believe it. For years, he had trusted the system, and for years, it had failed him. But now, for the first time, he had fought back, and won. Lisa walked up beside him, holding her phone. "The recording has over 1 million views already," she said, scrolling through the comments. "People are furious. They want every one of his cases reviewed." Mr. Johnson nodded, his heart heavy yet relieved. "That man ruined so many lives," he said. "But now he'll face the consequences." Just then, a woman approached them. She looked to be in her 60s, her face lined with worry. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you the man who exposed Judge Harrison?" Mr. Johnson hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Tears welled up in her eyes. "My son was sent to prison because of him. He was innocent, but we couldn't afford a good lawyer. The judge didn't even listen to us." She wiped her eyes quickly, trying to stay strong. "Because of you, maybe he'll finally get justice." Mr. Johnson felt a lump in his throat. He had thought this fight was just about his home, but it was bigger than that. It was about all the people who had suffered in silence, all the people who had lost everything because of one corrupt man. Lisa put a hand on his shoulder. "You changed things, Mr. Johnson. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone he's hurt." Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, looking out at the crowd. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. He had started something bigger than himself, and he wasn't going to stop now. "You said." The courtroom was packed. This time, it wasn't Judge Harrison sitting high above everyone, passing judgment. This time, he was the one on trial. The once powerful man sat in the defendant's chair, his hands cuffed, his expensive suit slightly wrinkled. Gone was the arrogant smirk he always wore. Instead, his face was pale, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Mr. Johnson sat in the front row, his hands folded in his lap. Lisa sat beside him, taking notes, her phone already buzzing with updates from reporters outside. The entire country was watching. Every news channel was covering the trial. The evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the bank statements, the testimonies of victims who had been silenced for years. The prosecutor stood up and played the recording Mr. Johnson had secretly made. The room fell silent as Judge Harrison's own voice echoed through the courtroom. "You pay, you stay. That's the way it's always been." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman in the back shook her head in disbelief. A man clenched his fists. People whispered among themselves, anger building. Judge Harrison shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. He had gotten away with this for years. He never thought he'd get caught. But now, there was no escape. The prosecutor turned to face the jury. This man abused his power. He destroyed lives. He made a mockery of justice. He pointed at the judge. But today, justice fights back. Mr. Johnson exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling. He had waited for this moment. He had dreamed of it. But now that it was here, he didn't feel joy. He didn't feel victory. He only felt relief. For too long, people like him had been ignored. But today, the truth was finally heard. "You said." The jury took only a few hours to reach a verdict. The tension in the courtroom was thick as everyone waited. Judge Harrison, once untouchable, now sat frozen in his chair, his hands gripping the table. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. He knew what was coming. The judge overseeing the trial looked at the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" A woman in the jury box stood up. She was in her 40s, with a strong, steady voice. "We have, Your Honor." She took a deep breath. "We find the defendant, Judge William Harrison, guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and even quiet cheers spread through the crowd. Mr. Johnson closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. Guilty. After everything he had lost, after all the pain and injustice, justice had finally won. Judge Harrison's face turned red with anger. "This is a joke," he muttered, shaking his head. "You can't do this to me. I am the law." The real judge banged his gavel. "Not anymore." He turned to the officers. "Take him away." The moment the handcuffs clicked around Judge Harrison's wrists, the weight on Mr. Johnson's chest lifted. He watched as the man who had ruined so many lives was led out of the courtroom, his head hanging low. The powerful judge was now nothing more than a disgraced criminal. Lisa turned to Mr. Johnson, a proud smile on her face. "You did it," she said. "You fought back, and you won." Mr. Johnson let out a deep breath. "We did it," he corrected. He looked around the courtroom, at the faces of the people who had once been afraid to speak up. They weren't afraid anymore. As he stepped outside, the crowd of reporters and supporters surrounded him. Microphones were shoved toward his face, cameras flashing. "Mr. Johnson, how do you feel about today's verdict?" one reporter asked. He paused for a moment, looking at the sea of people who had come to witness justice. He thought about his wife, his home, the life he had lost. Then he thought about the people who would never have to suffer like he did because of what he had done. "I feel free," he said simply. And for the first time in a long time, he truly was. The sun was setting as Mr. Johnson walked away from the courthouse. The golden light painted the city in soft hues, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt at peace. No more courtrooms, no more corrupt judges, no more battles just to be heard. Justice had been served. Lisa walked beside him, her phone still buzzing with news updates. "People are calling you a hero," she said with a smile. "Your story is inspiring so many. More victims of corruption are stepping forward. This is just the beginning." Mr. Johnson chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm no hero," he said. "I just did what had to be done." They stopped in front of a small cafe. Lisa put her phone away and looked at him seriously. "What's next for you, Mr. Johnson?" she asked. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know. He had spent years fighting just to survive. But now, with the weight lifted from his shoulders, the world felt open again. He could start over. He could help others. He could finally live without fear. "I think," he said after a moment, "I'm going home." Lisa frowned. "But you lost your home." Mr. Johnson smiled. "A house is just walls and a roof. Home is where you rebuild." Lisa nodded, understanding. "Wherever you go, you won't be alone. People are with you now." He took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in years. He had lost everything. But in the end, he had gained something even greater: strength, purpose, a voice that could no longer be silenced. As he walked away, the city buzzing around him, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning.